On a rainy Tuesday evening, Ethan sat in his favorite corner of the small, rustic coffee shop just 2 blocks from his office. The dim lighting, mixed with the cozy aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of people talking, gave him a rare sense of peace amidst his typically chaotic life. He was successful, hardworking, and lived for his career in finance, a fact reflected in his tailored suit and the subtle gleam of his luxury watch. Yet, somewhere in the bustle of making money and moving up the corporate ladder, he'd started feeling something missing. What that was, he couldn't quite place. As he sipped his espresso and scanned through some emails, a gentle laugh caught his attention. He looked up to see her, a beautiful young woman with a warm, natural smile and bright eyes that sparkled even in the low light. She was sitting a few tables away, laughing with the barista as if they'd been friends for years. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and there was a quiet elegance about her that seemed both effortless and magnetic. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Ethan felt compelled to approach her. Mustering the confidence that usually came so naturally to him in boardrooms and meetings, he walked over to her table, nervously clutching his coffee. "Excuse me," he began, his voice surprisingly shaky. "I couldn't help but notice you seem like you really enjoy this place." She looked up, her smile widening in a way that made him feel oddly at ease. "It's hard not to," she replied. "This place feels like a little escape from the city, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded, suddenly more relaxed. "Yeah, exactly. It's like an oasis of calm." "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Alice," she responded, extending her hand in a gentle shake. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." Their conversation flowed naturally after that. Alice had an effortless charm, an intelligence that sparkled with each word she spoke. She was quick-witted, making him laugh in a way he hadn't in a long time, and he quickly found himself lost in the warmth of her gaze. By the end of the evening, he had her number, and they promised to meet again soon. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself looking forward to his time with Alice more than anything else in his life. Their dates were filled with laughter, shared stories, and long conversations that lasted late into the night. Alice was different from anyone he had ever met. She wasn't materialistic or impressed by his success. She seemed to value the simple things, like walks in the park, cooking at home, or simply watching a movie on a quiet Friday night. Ethan was smitten. He couldn't believe his luck in finding someone who seemed to understand him so deeply, someone who made him feel so at peace. She seemed genuinely interested in his life, his dreams, and even his past. She asked about his childhood, his family, his struggles, and his successes with a sincerity that warmed his heart. But while Ethan was falling deeper, Alice had her own reasons for getting close to him, reasons she never intended to reveal. Alice was born and raised in a small, run-down house just a few blocks from the wealthy neighborhood where Ethan's family lived. While he had grown up in a comfortable, happy home, Alice's life had been the opposite. Her mother had struggled to make ends meet, marrying a man who worked odd jobs but never brought in enough to support them properly. Alice had watched her mother cry over unpaid bills, scavenging in thrift stores or even the trash on certain days to find things they needed. They often had to make do with things discarded by their richer neighbors, and Ethan's family had been one of those neighbors. She remembered Ethan from childhood, a young, smiling boy with all the privileges she'd never had. He wore new clothes every season, played with toys she could only dream of, and lived in a beautiful house that seemed to glow with the kind of happiness she'd never known. She remembered watching, her eyes filled with a mixture of jealousy and resentment, as he rode his bike down the street, laughing with his friends while she stood on her porch, wearing worn-out shoes and a hand-me-down dress. As she grew older, that bitterness festered. She despised how unfair life had been to her. The resentment she felt toward her circumstances transformed into a cold resolve. Someday, she would find a way to make things even. And that's when the plan began to form. The plan took years to take shape, but when she turned 18, Alice had made up her mind. She would find a way to get close to Ethan, make him fall in love with her, and take everything he held dear. She spent years preparing herself, building an image of the person she knew he would be drawn to. She worked on her charm, her poise, her confidence, skills she'd sharpened to perfection by the time she was ready to execute her plan. When she finally encountered him in that coffee shop, she was prepared. She knew he'd notice her. She had studied him enough to understand his type, his tastes, even the kind of woman he longed for but couldn't find in his wealthy, shallow circles. All she had to do was be that woman, and he would come to her. And he did. Ethan fell deeply for her, and as time went on, Alice found herself nestled comfortably in his life. She'd been introduced to his friends, who adored her, his family, who welcomed her warmly, and she'd even moved some of her belongings into his apartment, blending her world with his in a way that felt almost too easy. But as much as she despised him for the wealth and ease he'd grown up with, she couldn't deny the tenderness he showed her, the genuine love that shone in his eyes every time he looked at her. Despite herself, Alice felt a strange pang of guilt growing inside her. She hadn't expected to care for him, not in the way she was starting to. But her bitterness ran deep, and she forced herself to remember her purpose each time she felt herself softening. Her plan remained unchanged, and she had a partner, her longtime boyfriend, Kyle, who helped keep her focused. Kyle had been by her side since she was a teenager, a boy from the same poor neighborhood who understood her anger and shared her resentment. Kyle was ruthless, and his resolve didn't waver as hers sometimes did. He reminded her of their goal whenever she expressed hesitation, telling her that they both deserved the life they'd never had. He'd even come up with a scheme to drain Ethan's bank accounts once Alice had access to his financial information. They would leave him penniless and disappear, taking the life they'd always wanted with his money. But as the plan neared its final stages, Alice's guilt grew stronger. Ethan had introduced her to a world she'd never known, not just of material wealth but of trust, kindness, and real affection. Part of her felt trapped, torn between her loyalty to Kyle and her blossoming feelings for the man she had vowed to betray. One evening, after a long dinner out, Ethan and Alice returned to his apartment. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as they settled into bed. She was quiet, lost in her thoughts, as she lay beside him, staring up at the ceiling. The weight of her guilt was growing unbearable, and she could feel it pressing down on her as she closed her eyes, trying to silence her conflicted mind. Beside her, Ethan's breathing slowed as he drifted into sleep. Alice's phone, lying on the nightstand, vibrated softly. She reached over, glancing at the message. It was from Kyle. "Are we good to go tomorrow? You have the account details, right? Don't back out now, Alice. We've waited years for this." She felt her stomach churn as she read his words, knowing that tomorrow was supposed to be the day. Alice's heart pounded as she reread the message. She had planned every detail meticulously with Kyle. They would drain Ethan's accounts, transfer everything to a separate account, and by the time Ethan noticed anything was wrong, she and Kyle would be long gone, somewhere far away where he'd never find them. But as she lay beside Ethan, the warmth of his arm draped over her, guilt twisted painfully in her chest. She looked at his face, peaceful in sleep, and remembered all the small, tender moments they'd shared. Ethan had trusted her, opened his life to her without hesitation, showing her a side of himself that few people ever saw. Alice turned her phone screen off and closed her eyes, trying to shake off the rising doubt. "Focus, Alice," she thought. "You've come this far, and you know why you're doing this." She thought of her mother, of all the nights spent hungry, of the humiliation she'd faced watching Ethan's family live so comfortably just a few houses away. But this hatred, once sharp and burning, felt distant now. What replaced it was a sense of dread. She couldn't sleep. Sighing, she slipped out of bed, hoping the night air from the balcony would calm her nerves. But as she got up, she felt a gentle tug on her wrist. "Alice?" Ethan murmured, still half asleep. "Couldn't sleep. I'll be right back," she whispered, smiling down at him, trying to keep her voice steady. He released her hand, his eyes fluttering shut as he drifted back into slumber. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance, casting a glow over the skyline. Alice took a deep breath, the cool air brushing her skin, but it did nothing to soothe her racing thoughts. She'd waited years for this moment. And yet, as she stood there, on the edge of betraying the man who'd shown her kindness she never thought she'd deserve, the plan felt wrong. She went back inside, her decision unresolved. As she slid into bed beside him, her phone vibrated again. This time, Ethan stirred, his eyes half opening to the soft glow from her phone screen. "Is everything okay?" he asked, voice groggy with sleep. Yeah, just a message, she replied quickly, moving to tuck the phone away. But it was too late. His eyes sharpened, catching the unease in her expression. What's going on? He asked, his voice now alert. Alice forced a smile. Nothing important, just a friend asking about tomorrow. Ethan sat up slightly, studying her. You sure? You seem to have... There was genuine concern in his eyes, and it twisted something deep in her chest. For a moment, she felt herself wavering, and she could almost feel the truth teetering on the edge of her tongue. But then, something unexpected happened. Ethan gently reached over and took her hand, looking at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Alice, if there's something going on, you can tell me. I trust you, he said softly. His words struck her like a hammer, and the guilt she'd been carrying suddenly became unbearable. She looked away, afraid that if she met his gaze, the truth would pour out uncontrollably. But as she turned her head, her phone vibrated again on the nightstand, and she saw Kyle's name flashing on the screen. Ethan followed her gaze, noticing the name. His face changed, confusion turning to suspicion. Who's Kyle? Her heart raced, and she could feel her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She reached for the phone, but Ethan's hand was faster, gripping it before she could grab it. His face grew dark as he read the messages. His silence was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. Ethan looked at her, his face a mixture of hurt and betrayal. So, this was all a setup? His voice was barely above a whisper, raw with disbelief. Alice's hands shook, and she couldn't find her voice to explain, to justify, to beg for understanding. She hadn't anticipated this moment, hadn't prepared herself for the sheer devastation in his eyes. He got out of bed, the betrayal evident in every tense movement as he paced, clutching her phone. All this time, you were just waiting to take everything from me? Planning it with someone else? Her silence confirmed his suspicions. A painful realization dawned on him, and his expression hardened. Ooh, you hated me, didn't you? He asked, voice choked. All this time, you were faking everything? Alice tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She could only nod, her heart heavy with the realization of what she'd done. Ethan's face darkened as he handed her phone back. I can't believe I let you into my life, he said, his voice cold and distant. I gave you everything. The depth of his pain was almost palpable, and Alice's own heart broke as she looked at him. She had wanted revenge, but now, seeing him like this, she realized she had destroyed something beautiful, something she would never find again. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. Just leave. I don't want to see you again. Numbly, Alice gathered her things, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had achieved what she'd set out to do, but the victory felt hollow, lifeless. As she stepped out of his apartment and into the cold night, she realized that her bitterness had cost her more than she ever anticipated. In the silence of the darkened streets, she dialed Kyle's number, hearing his voice on the other end. It's over, she said quietly. What do you mean? What happened? He demanded. I can't do it. I'm done, she whispered, hanging up the phone before he could respond. As she walked away from Ethan's life, Alice felt a strange mix of loss and liberation. She had spent years chasing vengeance, but in the end, she had lost something she hadn't even known she could have, a genuine connection, something real. Ethan would never forgive her, and she would never forget him. And as she disappeared into the city's shadows, she was left alone with the realization that, in seeking to even the score, she had only left herself emptier than ever before.